welcome to Simon, who's here today to talk about his new book that we can see here, When Nations Can't Default, which is all about a history of war reparations, and basically wait with the questions until afterwards. Yeah, and then the scene is yours.
Thank you. How many do we have online?
I think 5 right now.
Cool. Thanks for the invite. If you have a burning question during, I think I'll be okay though. But I'll try to do something rather brief. I was invited to give a talk about my book, and I'll try to summarize it in like 30-45 minutes, if that's possible. It's a mix of a couple of different subjects, which means that some of them we need to go through quite a lot of different things, but essentially I'm trying to explain what are the macroeconomic implications when you face a very large payment that you have to pay, even if you don't want to. And I'll try to make it a little bit current in the end, because it's a topic that's quite a hot topic in the geopolitical world right now. Back when I started, so this is the book version of my PhD. So I started back in 2015, in which case this was a very niche topics that no one really paid that particular attention to. With Russia, Ukraine, it's all of a sudden all the rage, not only because they clearly should pay reparations, but also because of the idea that there's so much money trapped in Europe that you potentially could use, and then say that that we will pay reparations later. Why don't we just give the money to Ukraine? But maybe if we have time, I'll get back to that. What I did is that I tried to look at war reparations from sort of a new angle. Before my book, reparations were mostly thought of as either a capacity to pay problem. So Keynes after Versailles, all the economic commentators after both Napoleonic Wars and Franco-Prussian Wars, it was really a matter of, is there a capacity to pay this fiscal burden? Or as a transfer problem, what are the secondary implications on especially the terms of trade when you have to face a very large payment? Those were sort of the two economic spheres in which you thought about reparations. I tried to look at it from a sovereign debt angle, so more of a standard open macroeconomics idea where the ability to pay is much more of a willingness to pay. And if we think about it in that sort of sense, like, should reparations be repaid, and what are the costs that we would consider given that they're forced to pay something that most countries wouldn't? So it's the idea of what happens when countries pay back something that we would consider traditionally to be unsustainable. Now, war reparations go back a very, very long time, at least as far as 241 BC, when Rome imposed a indemnity on the Carthage following the first Punic War. And since then, I'm sure there were reparations before. They might not have called them reparations, but sometimes it's just stealing or plundering. But it's been part of every war in some form since then. From way back to the first Punic War, obviously we have much less data or treaties or written down evidence. So we don't have that good a reference on the full history, which means that if we want to study it from an economic perspective, I do it from the last 200 years, because that's when they started writing these numbers down into treaties. We have some sort of macroeconomic numbers. We have financial market data, so we can actually try to test some of these things. And war reparations today are enshrined in international law after the Hague Convention of 1907, which essentially says that a belligerent party which violates provisions of the regulations can be liable to pay reparations. It was also the Hague Convention which stipulated that you don't enforce sovereign debts by military force. So it did away with the debtor's prison for sovereign debts. And it is now more or less thought of as international customary law. So it's also in the Geneva Conventions. Just because it's in international law, I mean, there were reparations before, there have been reparations after. They don't always adhere to the current guided principles. It can take many forms. Most often, it's just hard currency. It can take the form of precious metal, other sort of natural resources, assets, whether industrial assets or agriculture assets, intellectual property, and sort of like compensation for very specific damages. And they can be very small in macroeconomic terms, or they can be very big. So war reparations in itself doesn't really say anything about the type of damage that a country pays after a war. And up here is sort of like the cases that I've studied in my book, which is, I think, almost all war reparations since 1800, ranging from essentially meaningless in macroeconomic terms, with the Mexican-American War is less than 1% of GDP, to hugely damaging, macroeconomically speaking. Iraq paid 4 times its 1990 GDP in reparations after the Gulf War in 1991, and only paid the last installment in 2022. So the range at which you think about war reparations is quite big. But regardless of how you think about war reparations, the column all the way to the right, whether they were repaid in full, is, except if you are Germany, almost always the case that the answer is yes. And even in the case of Germany, who are the only 2 cases where there wasn't a full repayment, it was a negotiated standstill. So you didn't default, you didn't do like a hard default on war reparations. Now, how do we think about war reparations as a liability of the government? If we think about how governments or countries fund their expenses, they can take in taxes, they can print money, they can sell their assets, or they can do it via debt issuance. Because war reparations very often have a short maturity profile, somewhere between often 3 or 5 years, and it's quite significant in GDP terms, it makes a lot of sense to try to transform this liability into a longer term asset, which is why almost all the big ones, there's been sovereign debt issuance to try to pay off the debt, not only to make it into a more manageable yearly expense, but also because until at least World War I, the way that these payments were enforced was essentially by occupation. And the occupation was paid for by the loser of the war. So the interest rate, if you tried to push it out, was quite significant. And not only that, you obviously didn't have control of your land. So the incentive to try to get rid of this huge payment quite fast is quite big. If we try to think about sovereign debt as a sovereign debt issue, because we live in a global society, countries do things that they don't want to do all the time, even if it's not necessarily in their microeconomic best interest. One of them is that sometimes they pay off debt that maybe they shouldn't do if we just run our models. There are some exceptions where you sort of step out and completely withdraw from the global economic trading system. 2 big ones is obviously Russia in 1917, the communist takeover, and China in 1947 with the similar thing. They defaulted on their debts, they stopped, they repudiated all of it, but obviously sovereign debt was a secondary issue. No one really think that they had a communist takeover because they had sovereign debt issues. States can default on their debts and remain in the global order. We have a normal way of doing that, but it's still not costless. you have a way of either you have exclusion from some sort of trading regime, you usually have output loss, you have financial market disruptions. There are many things, but you can default. The difference is that if you try to default on war reparations, your outcome is much more likely to be Russia 1917 or China 47, where the idea of state survival might not be an option. It's why we see no defaults on reparations, even in the case of Germany after World War One. And in the way that I try to think about this is that all the models that we have, you have sort of a cost, and that cost we try to think of as how much does it cost to repay your sovereign debt, and obviously that's the interest payments or maturities that come due, and the benefits are continued access to borrowing. The classic reputational sovereign debt models, where the reason that you borrow on sovereign debt markets is because you would like to smooth your consumption and don't have all these volatility gaps, because obviously tax payments, tax receipts are somewhat volatile. So the standard model, simplified a little bit here, but essentially you have a case where value of continued debt service, once the value of default is bigger, the country defaults. And this is sort of like the way that I try to think about, if we thought that it was possible to default on war reparations, where would we sit in the in this space? And if we try to go through some of the examples, the first one I have is from the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon lost, was sent to Elba in 1914, came back, and the first time he was defeated, there was no talk of war reparations. They just wanted peace. The second time he came back, there was talk of war reparations because the other Allied powers were quite tired of France and wanted to essentially cripple the country economically. So they had a peace settlement after Waterloo, where quite large reparations payments were enforced. At the time, it was somewhere between 20 and 25% of GDP, which was payable or which would do in 5 years. So 5% of GDP after a war in which you probably spend all of your money on the military, but also back then the tax revenues as part of the overall economy were much smaller. The tax was essentially to fund the military. So we had the Napoleonic Wars, where everyone who wrote in the newspapers at the time thought that this is not something that France can fund easily. There is no way that they can borrow so much on financial markets, and it's going to be a disaster economically. Skip forward 1 year, and France tries to do a sovereign debt issue, and it's oversubscribed because they get help from the banking houses in London and Amsterdam. The Barings and the Amsterdam and Hope, the big banking houses of the time, underwrite the first small loan. And in a secondary loan, they end up borrowing essentially from the Paris Stock Exchange members, and ends up in 1 year to actually issue debt to more or less pay it off in 2 years. The debt stock as a percentage of GDP tripled. I mean, it came from a very low perspective, but essentially, when you think that France was in war for 20, 30 years beforehand without a meaningful increase in debt to GDP, and then that jumps once war ends. This is sort of the case. And back then we don't have good output data, so we don't really know if the economy crippled. But from what evidence we do have, it seems like it was relatively okay. If I try to run standard like the sovereign debt model I have, where you have a benevolent government, takes all the right decisions, specify to what data we do have on the various cases, you end up with a default set, which essentially is a function of how far below your potential output are you, and what is the debt stock. So if you are at or above your potential output, then you can carry quite a lot of debt stock on the one axis, and then you have output, tradable output on the other one. And this case is from the Franco-Prussian War indemnities. So France invaded Prussia in 1970. That turned out to be a remarkably short war. And Bismarck essentially broke the French military in a year, and as a punishment did a somewhat of the same size indemnity as you had after the Napoleonic Wars. The difference was at this time France was actually quite rich. They had net foreign assets of somewhere around that number, and they were able to borrow the money very quickly. They were never in really big economic problems. In the first year after the war, there was a big fall in output of 5 to 10%. But as the war ended, that quickly rebounded, and they went back to trend fairly quickly. They borrowed the money, they sent the German troops home, and the 25% of GDP was paid in less than 3 years. By a combination of asset sales and debt issuance. The foreign assets obviously is also an incentive not to do something completely crazy, because if you have trading relationships, if you have assets in foreign countries that can be confiscated, you don't want to antagonize all of your trading partners. You want to maintain ability to actually access those assets. Which was the case here. And these two French reparations were sort of what laid the groundwork for the World War I cases, because everyone saw that these two cases, they repaid the money fairly quickly. It didn't look like there was much macroeconomic problems, and that was sort of like the baseline playbook for the later years. We move forward a little bit to the big one. Obviously, everyone, the interwar years are much more researched than all of the other ones. So there is less historical problems with both getting data and the actual history. What I want to do here is try to tell you a little bit about how reparations help the different cycles of the interwar years. Because when you look at the diplomatic cables at Versailles in the years after World War I, where they tried to agree on reparations, they were very acutely aware in the various foreign ministries that 25% was paid after the Franco-Prussian War and after Napoleonic Wars. And that was sort of where they agreed that this is sort of like the war reparations that we want Germany to pay. The problem was that they sort of punted the issue of the final payment to a commission, which then took a few years to come up with a schedule, and they had a 25% of GDP payment in reparations, but then they added in a 75% payment for other damages on top, which meant that the war reparations were 4 times larger than anything we'd seen historically. Not only that, but because it took a few years, the German public also had an idea that it would only be a 25% number. And the war, you didn't really have any soldiers in Germany by the time you announced the war reparation to say how big is, like, how are we going to enforce this? So by the time that they announced the number, you end up with tax boycotts. You end up with a German public who is very unhappy with having to pay most of their tax to foreign creditors. And this helps fuel part of the political unrest that occurs in the early 1920s in Germany. It is a big part of it. It's not the only part, but it definitely didn't help. And because this was payable in foreign currency, obviously, once the currency and the inflation starts to go, the real cost of this becomes exorbitantly bigger very fast. Germany tries to default on reparations and misses a payment in 1922, which means that France invades, the Allies invades the Ruhr to enforce this payment. And this is one of the few times that we've actually seen military action to enforce. Otherwise, it's usually just threats, which are enough. But they pay, and they end up with going from having to pay the 100 to doing something called the Dawes Plan, where you essentially transform the liability so that it is not senior, but you encourage foreign creditors, mainly in the US, to lend money to Germany, which is then used to pay back the reparations. This goes on for some time. It goes okay for growth. You end up with an inflation regime which is sort of stabilized, and you have a few 5 years where things are going okay. But the reason it's going okay is that all of the money that are owed in reparations is essentially paid by the countries who are owed the money, which means that you can see this very clearly in the current account that money is just flowing out of Germany. So one debt is transmitted into another, and the reason it works is that it's sort of hidden and no one really sees that. The way it works is by running these big current account deficits. Running big current account deficits is only possible if money keeps flowing in. And that is sort of a problem when you have the Great Depression starting everywhere else, and people want to take the money home, which means that Germany faces a classic sudden stop of money inflow that we know from emerging markets to this day. And they don't have the money to pay these reparations. You end up with a new plan, the Young Plan, but the problem is that if you can't borrow abroad, then you have to fund it yourself via austerity, unless you're willing to try to default, which they weren't, which means that real growth this time completely crashes. You have a deflationary environment where there is a government which keeps tightening its belt. There is nowhere else that growth can come from. Deflation this time, the stop and rolling over of payments is quite a direct influence on Hitler coming to power. This is where most of the literature says that Germany could pay, and it made sense for them to pay all the way up until 1932, where there was an agreement with the US to do a standstill and effectively cancel reparations. When I tried to run, a sovereign, my little sovereign debt model of at what point do these interest rate payments make sense when you consider what the cost of a potential default is, and by default, entering autarky and having to fund these yourself. The last 2 years essentially are just making the problem bigger. So the historical research, all the German authors generally say that there was no way that you could default in 1931, because at this time there was still a possibility to make it through on the other side and hope that you could restructure and the money keeps flowing in. If we take a willingness to pay approach, one of the classic sovereign debt models, and regardless of how I try to parameterize it, by the 1930s, once you start taking the actual reparation deadline into place, we are very, very close to a default set. And for every year that you're in the default set, where you don't default and try to clean up your balance sheet, it only becomes more painful. this becomes very clear when we go to Finland, because Germany were in default and actually in a couple of years managed to negotiate a standstill. So we don't they had other problems in the 1930s, but the reparation issue sort of went away. Whereas in Finland, they ended up paying fairly sizable reparations after World War II. But unlike Germany, they actually had the payments for quite a while, and all the normal macroeconomic tools that a government has to sort of try to alleviate capacity to pay problems, they didn't have. So they had to pay their foreign debts, and they couldn't default on it, even though I would argue that they should. I'll tell why in a moment. So instead, we end up with a macroeconomic situation in Finland after the war, which is just terrible. So after World War II, the Allies had learned from the fiasco after World War I, so there weren't meaningful reparations for all the countries on the Allied side. But the Soviet bloc was a little different, and especially different for the country in limbo, which is Finland. Because the Soviet demanded reparations worth 20 to 30% of GDP when you transfer it into a hard currency. They were paid in kind, so essentially a lot of industrial assets and a lot of timber. And the way that they paid was essentially they took out a big loan to the US, from the US, to build enough assets that they could then send to the Soviet. But Finland was in a precarious situation because geopolitically speaking, they were sort of in between two chairs, and they couldn't really antagonize either too much. Obviously, the US, they would like to stay friends, and Soviet, you had a very big country on the border, which you didn't really want to go to war with. So they end up paying, and Finland is for many years solidly in the default territory. Anything close to a macroeconomic situation in which we would consider in the last 50 years, no one would have repaid their debt. Finland repaid their debt. And they did so while undergoing severe macroeconomic problems. These charts, I know you can't really see them, so I'll just explain what they are. But it's the solid line in each of the little squares is the model output, and the dotted line is Finland's actual macroeconomic numbers. So up top to the left, and you have tradable output, so essentially just output normalized to 1. Normally, you see a default happening when output contracts by more than 15%. Before that, it might not make that much sense. Finland's output collapsed by 25% and actually stayed low for quite a while, because they didn't have the option of defaulting on their debt, thereby freeing up the balance sheet to deal with the problems. They had to fund the hard currency payments from a smaller economic pie, while seeing their yields that they borrowed at exploding. That's up to the right. That's the spread on Finnish government bonds. It went from 8% and about 14%, way above what you would consider sustainable in an economy like Finland. The middle ones are the debt level. That's just where Finland was at. And the real wage halved in Finland during the time, and that occurred by both the relative price of tradables and by the nominal exchange rate. They devalued the mark 3 times in 5 years, which was sort of the only tool that they had to try to get the economy back into place. Obviously, they ended up with an inflation problem as well, because they had all these debts in another currency. And it was only really solved when they ended up getting an IMF program and had some years of economic growth. and pushed the payments out by negotiating with the Soviets. But the point really is that these types of debts are enforced either by military or by geopolitical force, and they are something that you can't really default on, even if all macroeconomic sense would say that there is no benefit to paying this debt, because the volatility in the outputs has already occurred, and you don't really get any benefit from being able to roll over incredibly expensive loans. I have the last one here, which in the book is quite a big part of it, but after Finland and World War II, you had essentially 40 years where there were very few, if any, war reparations, because the US didn't demand war reparations from its allies, and the Soviets, even if they did subtract substantial payments, did so by just stealing or confiscating. So they were never part of any international treaty where we can analyze it. But that changed in Iraq. First, you had the Iran-Iraq war, where everyone hated Iran because of the Ayatollah's rise to power, and especially the embassy takeover in Tehran in '79. So you had a unique case where every side on the geopolitical world rooted for Iraq. Iraq managed to take on a lot of debt during the 10 years that followed that, essentially by getting grants and loans to buy money to fight Iran. And after the war, Saddam sort of had an idea that he wanted to be the strong man of the Middle East, and went from Iran and tried to invade Kuwait. At which point the US coalition sort of beat them rather quickly. And as part of the agreement back then, you know, the Soviet was disintegrating. The US felt very strongly about protecting especially Saudi interests. So it was agreed that there would be war reparations. And this time war reparations were codified in a UN charter, National Council resolutions, which set up a commission under the UN, which was allowed to directly confiscate a certain amount of oil revenues. In the beginning, it was 30% of all oil sales. It's later lowered to 5%. But it was a massive amount of money. Iraq could theoretically pay because they have quite big oil reserves, but the economy it went from being one of the most prosperous in the 1970s to being isolated, war-torn, and bankrupt by the end of the 1980s. So the reason that war reparations in Iraq were 400% of GDP is essentially that GDP collapsed. The nominal dollar amounts is not small, but the reason it's so big is really that you saw a massive collapse in the debt carrying capacity. After the reparations were sort of imposed, they came alongside sanctions for many years and financial isolation. No one traded with Iraq during the 1990s. The only sort of trading that you saw was the Food for Oil program, where there was a little bit of oil sales with some food the other way, which was meant to try to alleviate some of the humanitarian disaster that was going on, but only helped Saddam tighten his grip on political power, because now he also controlled additional food resources. The payments for reparation as a result were not really forthcoming during the 1990s, but never went away. And after the US invaded Iraq and restructured the sovereign debt, the payments for reparations kept flowing. And they kept flowing because they were sort of kept separate. And the UNCC, which was housed in Geneva, could every month just take a slice of the money flowing from oil sales and use it to pay reparations to the households in Kuwait who had applied for it. It ended up being $52 billion in today's money. It's quite a sizable payment. The last one came December 2022. And even though they restructured all the debts that Iraq restructured the debts that they occurred during the war, reparations were never even close to being restructured. If you talk to some of the either diplomats or bankers who were involved in the sovereign debts restructuring in 2003 to 8, after Iraq was changing governments from Saddam to US-led coalition, no one really even tried to consider that maybe the reparations should be part of a general restructuring. So the payments were made. Iraq is now in okay economic position because of oil. So it's still quite poor, but the external accounts look good. And that's sort of the last historical reparation that I have in my book. It went okay for Iraq because it was directly linked to the oil sales that they had. They didn't experience the classic economic output disaster stemming from reparations. Reparations in that case was more of a sideshow. The problem stemmed from the sanctions and the exclusion from trade, which were sort of several issues. I think I have 2 minutes just to talk about the last one, which is the Russian case. If you sort of look at all the wars that have ended in reparations in the last 200 years, I think it's fair to say that the sort of normal case where a country that is able to borrow money on financial markets and pay it back rather quickly, you can borrow 20-25% of GDP without any big problems. Russia has huge reserves. If we try to take the 20-25% of GDP and make it into a current number, that's somewhere between 330 to 420-ish billion euro in GDP terms. Which, if you were to try to structure reparations from the macroeconomic perspective, you would say this is definitely doable. Russia currently has around 300 billion euros in frozen assets. That sort of is a direct money. Obviously, it would be quite new. It would be, I think, unprecedented to pay reparations before the war is over. Normally, you end up waiting. But if you look at the way that you normally calculate reparations, is that you set up a commission where you say everyone who had damages done can submit a claim, and then we sort of add it up. And usually the way it works is that you add up all the claims that you get, and then you divide by a number which is normally bigger than 3 and less than 5. The Kiev School of Economics runs a register already, where they register all the claims that are coming in. The number is already far above 300 billion, just in damages. Then if you add in the loss of running a war economy instead of a market economy, the number becomes even bigger. One way that they currently is quite a big of, I think, speed moving towards is to say that Ukraine clearly has a claim against Russia for war reparations. They also really need money now so that they don't lose the war. Right now, I think that the best idea is that a lot of people are talking about, by a lot of people, the US government is proposing to give Ukraine a loan, which is collateralized by their claim to reparations. And then the loan, if you make it non-recourse, then it doesn't add up to Ukraine's debt stock overall. Then they can get the money now, and then once the war is over, the US or Europe can decide what to do about the money. Either you can set it off and just take the money that Russia has in accounts, or you can, as part of a peace negotiation, you can actually put this money into play. later on. But that's sort of why it's a current topic that's quite big. I think that's 40 minutes. But yeah, happy to do questions if you have any.
Yeah.